The Warhammer 40k universe is absolutely bursting with unsolved mysteries, whether they be centered on events that defy rational explanation, or mysterious entities that had all accounts pertaining to their existence aggressively covered up by the Inquisition. One of the grimdark future's most mysterious characters is an unsanctioned creation made in secret by Archmagos Belisarius Cawl, a space marine of giant proportions, clad in gray ceramite plate bearing no distinguishable features. He has no chapter, no heraldry, and there exist no records of his existence. Giant even amongst the Astartes, he is a being of immense physical and psychic ability, and is rumored to have been created through a blasphemous and highly illegal series of experimentations that sought to combine both the powers and genetic material of all 20 of the Emperor's Primarch sons. This individual has no true name to speak of, and is known simply as Alpha Primus. This absolute beast of a space marine has stood by his creator's side for over 10,000 years, operating unseen in the shadows to carry out the Archmagos' dirty work. Whether that take the form of fighting against the abominations of Fabius Bile, hunting down ancient Xenos relics, or even going up against the forces of the Emperor's Holy Inquisition. Now, some may dismiss Alpha Primus as simply one of Cawl's many abandoned experiments, but if the rumors are to be believed, he may be something far crazier. He may in fact be one of the most important characters in the entire Warhammer 40k setting, and we may just be witnessing the very beginning of his story. But who or what is Alpha Primus? Is he the next step in Astartes or even human evolution, or is he a horrifying mistake that the Imperium was never meant to see? Is he simply a failed prototype, a brand new Primarch, or even a Primaris equivalent of one? Or, as some fans believe, is he a backup plan for the Emperor himself? A living vessel engineered to contain the divine essence of the Master of Mankind, a herald of his resurrection. Well, in this video, we're going to be diving into all that and a whole lot more. But before we dive headfirst into the grimdark, a quick shout out to this video's sponsor. Today's video is sponsored by Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus, the definitive tactile Warhammer gaming experience on mobile. It's got everything a fan of the grimdark future could possibly want. Over 70 iconic champions, 18 playable factions, extensive PvE and PvP content, and a super nostalgic art style. The big news this month is that the Genestealer cult faction is getting a brand new epic hero. Everybody's favorite three-armed assassin, the Kellermorph, is finally getting added to the game. Her active ability, Heroic Fusillade, allows her to drop an AoE nuke on top of her target and any enemies that are unlucky enough to be nearby. Now, that's already really strong, but she gets even crazier as she's also almost impossible to completely remove. Not only does her passive allow her to not drop below 30% health on the first enemy attack against her, but when attacked, she automatically moves away and deploys a decoy that confuses your opponent. If they ever actually manage to finish her off and fail to kill all of the decoys, she'll come back again at full health, with her active ability refreshed. If you haven't started playing Tacticus yet, now is the perfect opportunity to download the game for free by using my link in the description or by scanning my QR code. When you do, you can use code WES0425 to unlock a bunch of free rewards. Big thanks to Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus for sponsoring this video. I know I say this in a lot of my videos as it applies to a lot of things in 40k, but I'm gonna say it again for old time's sake. The origins of Alpha Primus can trace their way all the way back to the end of the Horus Heresy. After the heresy had concluded, after Guilliman had restructured the Imperium and implemented the Codex Astartes, he tasked Belisarius Cawl with a multitude of projects, from creating a life-sustaining suit of armor known as the Armor of Fate, to preserving the Emperor's flaming sword. Now, chief amongst these projects, however, was a task that bordered on heresy itself, to improve upon the Emperor's own designs. Guilliman ordered Cawl to create a new breed of Space Marines, one that would be bigger, faster, stronger, and more capable than anything that had come before. To assist in this impossible goal, Guilliman entrusted Cawl with an artifact of unimaginable value, the Sang Primus Portum, also known in the Horus Heresy novels as the Magna Mater. This relic contained the genetic material from each of the Primarchs in its purest, most undiluted form. For a skilled geneticist who could decipher the data within, it was nothing less than a treasure trove of the Emperor's secrets and ancient wisdom. This Primaris project, as it would come to be called, was a closely guarded secret, and while Guilliman likely intended to keep a close eye on the eccentric Archmagos, that unfortunately did not come to pass. You see, shortly afterwards, Guilliman would end up getting mortally wounded by Fulgrim during the Scouring, and would spend the next 10,000 years in stasis. Now, given what we know about Cawl today, it's difficult to understand why Guilliman would do this, but in his defense, he wasn't really wrong to have some trust at the time. Cawl hadn't gone full mad scientist yet, but by the time of the 41st millennium, more than half of the Adeptus Mechanicus views him as a radical heretic. And after Guilliman's resurrection, those suspicions were all but confirmed for him. He now openly admits that Cawl cannot be entirely trusted. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Back in the 31st millennium, Cawl, being the eccentric genius that he is, wielding the Sang Primus Portum, having access to effectively unlimited resources, and operating under unadvised minimal supervision, began experimenting in dozens of different directions. At one point during the Primaris project, but importantly before the first successful Primaris Marine was ever created, Cawl made something different. Something he chose to keep secret even after the Primaris were revealed to the galaxy. An unsanctioned creation known as Alpha Primus. Now, at first glance, Alpha Primus looks like any other Space Marine, but with a few notable exceptions. The first and most obvious being the fact that he's absolutely massive, described as a giant even by the standards of Primaris Marines. Now, Games Workshop, in true fashion, doesn't really give us exact figures nowadays, so when it comes to his actual height, I don't want to go too far and make any wild claims here. But we know that Primaris Marines average between 8 and 9 feet tall, and they still called him a giant. I think it's safe to say that he's at least somewhere in the realm of 10 to 11 feet, which would put him roughly on the same size as a custodian, but possibly even taller. That being said, there's nothing really concrete here. There's nothing even semi-measurable, like with everyone's favorite shark daddy Tiberius, who's said to be a head taller than his brothers. All we know for sure is that Primus is a big beefy boy. His armor is said to be unpainted gunmetal ceramite, bearing none of the traditional heraldry seen on other Space Marines. No insignias, no chapter markings, just cold, silent function. And out of armor, he's, and I'm putting it as gently as I can, a Frankenstein's monster of patchwork skin grafts and dense scar tissue. In the first book he appears in, The Great Work, his face was described as appearing like it had been butchered, like he had been ripped apart and stitched back together multiple times. But in his subsequent appearance in Genefather, the description we're given is not quite as jarring. Maybe beauty standards between Space Marine chapters are different, or Cawl ended up doing some work on him between the events of the two books, but either way, in this one, he was described as, and I quote, not exactly ugly. So let's just call him a solid 6. Primus is said to exist in a constant state of pain due to the many surgeries and experiments Cawl subjected him to. And while his demeanor is generally stoic, it radiates a sense of profound sadness, agony, and barely restrained violence. He's portrayed as somber and bellicose, slow to anger, yes, but also visibly agitated. The signs of frustration are always there, a lip twitch here, tonal shifts there, and a deep, lingering disinterest in all of the conversations happening around him. It's like he's always suppressing something just beneath the surface. Since the moment of his creation, Primus has stood by Cawl's side as both his bodyguard and his right-hand man for missions that would be, let's say, unwise for the Archmagos to be connected to directly, whether that means physically involved or, as more often is the case, perceived involvement by his peers and rivals. For thousands of years, Primus has carried out Cawl's dirty work, everything from acquiring Xenos technology to eliminating threats to Cawl's research. And not all of those targets are the enemies of mankind specifically. In the short story To Speak As One, we see Primus storm a space station controlled by the Inquisition in order to steal a sarcophagus containing a captured Necron. Now, this Necron would actually be the one that would go on to teach Cawl how to control Necron constructs, and he now has a whole collection of pet scarabs because apparently he just thinks they're neat, and I find that hilarious. The relationship between these two characters is complicated. On the surface, Primus presents as loyal. He's never outright betrayed Cawl, but whenever he gets the chance to speak openly about his creator, it's clear he holds him in absolute contempt. In Avenging Son, during the scene where Cawl finally reveals the Primaris Marines aboard his ship to Guilliman and a gathered auditorium of high-ranking Imperials, Primus uses the opportunity to quietly warn another Space Marine in attendance that Cawl cannot be trusted, knowing full well that that warning would make its way back to Guilliman. When questioned on his motives, he tells them not to worry, he's loyal to the Imperium and the Emperor, just not to his creator. Cawl's perception of Primus, on the other hand, is the polar opposite. He absolutely adores him. Cawl refers to him as his ultimate achievement. He constantly showers him with praise, celebrates his successes, and urges him to fully embrace his strength and intellect. He behaves like a loving, and when I say loving, I mean aggressively loving father figure. And considering that Cawl used some of his own DNA in Primus's creation, that description isn't just metaphorical. Now, do I absolutely love the dynamic between these two? Yes, I do. Do I find it hilarious and deeply entertaining to see this insectile mechanical monster man acting like a proud dad to his angry Frankenstein Space Marine son who hates his guts? Also yes. But what makes their dynamic truly compelling to me is the dark undertones boiling just beneath the surface. In a literal and figurative sense, Cawl does view Primus as his son. But for all of his genius, Cawl is fundamentally incapable of understanding that kind of relationship. And this is something that's definitely not unique to these two. It's a prevalent theme throughout a lot of factions and character dynamics throughout 40k, especially with the Space Marines. Now, after undergoing their transformation into transhuman demigods, Space Marines begin to lose their connection to humanity. Their memories of their former lives begin to fade away, and their capacity to relate to ordinary people, even their own families, slowly vanishes. Cawl may not be a Space Marine, but the same logic applies here. The man is 10,000 years old. He has almost no organic components left. His mind is a gestalt consciousness containing dozens of different intellects interwoven with mechanical subminds. He's had memories deleted, rewritten, downloaded, and uploaded into backup data vaults. There's just too much of him to fit into a single being. And once you realize that, once you see what Cawl really is, it's easy to understand why Primus holds him in such disdain. This isn't a real father-son bond. It's a grotesque mockery of one. It's not paternal love, it's an inventor celebrating himself through the praise of his greatest creation. Primus has even been noted as remarking that Cawl has a fondness for jokes, and that he, Alpha Primus, is simply one of them. The complexity of their relationship only deepened in the climax of the Genefather novel, wherein Primus ends up getting captured by Fabius Bile, and for a minute there, it really looks like the spider is going to kill him. In that moment, Cawl drops his arrogant, smug demeanor and shows actual, genuine fear. Now, we know that he views him as his son, but he's never said that out loud before. But here, in this moment, he calls him his son and says that he loves him. Now, I'm not gonna lie, that scene definitely got me choked up a little bit, and it's one of the few moments where the emotional core of 40k ends up shining through. But let's be real, it doesn't erase 10,000 years of pain, suffering, and manipulation that Primus has been subjected to. If you've read the Genefather book, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this dynamic down in the comment section below, because I'm still honestly trying to figure out exactly how I feel about it myself. Okay, so now we know who and what Alpha Primus is and his relationship with his creator, but just how powerful is he really? Well, first and foremost, Primus is both an incredibly potent psyker and blessed with immense physical strength, far beyond anything we've ever seen from either a Firstborn or even a standard Primaris Marine. For example, it's fairly common for psychers and Space Marine librarians to wield force weapons in battle, but Primus outright states that he has no interest in them, because, and I quote, he's strong enough to punch a chainsword through the bulkhead of a ship. During a battle in Genefather, we see him issue a palm strike against one of Fabius Bile's abominations, and the flavor text tells us that this blow, even though Primus was at his weakest and had been fighting non-stop for way too long, was strong enough to kill a mortal man instantly, shattering their ribcage and bursting their heart. We've seen him defeat the ultimate creations of Bile, hold his own against hordes of enemies without backup, and display a mastery of psychic abilities. He can detect the presence of psychers from a considerable distance away, hurl and pull objects with telekinesis, snatch an enemy's weapon mid-combat and crush it as if it was made of wet paper. He's an absolute unit. But he's not just brawn, he's also described as being ridiculously intelligent, capable of processing information far faster than even other Space Marines, and possesses a savant-like understanding of combat tactics and battlefield strategy. He also never really appears visibly shaken, even when facing overwhelming odds, as if he subconsciously knows that they hold nothing against him. And this is where things start to get really interesting with him, because Primus isn't a normal Space Marine. He doesn't share a singular genetic legacy with any one Primarch. That means he isn't confined to a single personality archetype or a specialized trait like with Marines from the Legions and Chapters. He's like what would happen if you took all of the strengths of all of the different Space Marine legions and merged them into one supreme entity. Now, before we go any further, this is where we're going to start to get a little bit speculative. As a tradition with Games Workshop, almost none of these things about Primus are explicitly spelled out for us. The lore, as is often the case, is frustratingly vague here, almost like Games Workshop is deliberately leaving themselves some plausible deniability. It could be that more books are planned featuring Alpha Primus, and right now they're just building up the mystery. Or maybe they want some wiggle room in the future in case they decide to pivot with the character without needing to shoehorn in a clunky retcon. That being said, there are some pretty obvious clues that are all but being completely spelled out for us, especially when it comes to the Primarchs used in his creation. The first being Magnus the Red of the Thousand Suns, due to Primus's potent psychic abilities and capacity for astral projection. The second being Corvus Corax of the Raven Guard, since Primus has demonstrated the ability to move completely undetected, vanishing and reappearing at will in a manner identical to wraith slipping. But when it comes to the other Primarchs used to make him, things get a little bit trickier, as a lot of them could be chalked up to any number of different factors. His overwhelming strength? That could come from Angron, Vulcan, or Ferrus Manus, or maybe Cawl just engineered him to be significantly stronger than a normal Marine. His overwhelming intellect? Well, you could attribute that to Rabute Guilliman, Perturabo, or Rogel Dorn, or maybe his brain is just half mechanical and networked with subminds. His insane durability? Well, that might be a trait borrowed from Mortarion, or it could simply be the result of enduring constant agony for 10,000 years. I don't know, something about that seems like it might just raise an individual's threshold for pain a little bit. I could go on here, but I think you get the idea. Now, if you've noticed anything with him in particular that you think is definitely linked to one of the Primarchs, let me know all about it in the comment section, as I love reading your guys' theories. Now, given just how eccentric and over-the-top Belisarius Cawl often is, it's my personal belief that there's a little piece of every Primarch in Alpha Primus. And maybe not always in the form of a flashy superpower, but at least something. A personality trait, a memory, a predisposition. But again, that's just my own headcanon. There's nothing concrete in the text that I can use to confirm or deny it. In fact, even Primus himself doesn't fully know who or what he is. During the events of Avenging Son, he reveals that he only knows bits and pieces about himself. In a scene where he's watching Guilliman during Call's grand presentation, he confides in another Space Marine that he knows something of what he is, but doesn't have the full picture. He says this: "To each of his sons, the Emperor gave some of his gifts. I doubt any one being other than he could contain such power in its entirety. To each of the sons of those sons, a portion of those gifts were passed on in turn. I have several of these gifts, as many as Cawl dared give me. Such majesty the Emperor engineered into the Primarchs, whereas I am an abomination, made by a second-rate tinkerer." Now, in my personal opinion, the most interesting tidbit that we've gotten about Alpha Primus in the recent material actually comes from Fabius Bile, and specifically his reaction to Primus at the very end of the Genefather novel. If you haven't read the book, it's this intersecting point between both Cawl and Bile's story arcs, a classic versus story, two giants of intellect on opposite ends of the morality spectrum finally going up against each other. Throughout the events of the book, Bile consistently dismisses all of Call's achievements. He calls him a generalist, which is a grave insult coming from Bile. He says that he's never made anything truly his own. He just innovates on the work of greater minds that came before him. That is all until the end of the book, where in an event I won't fully spoil, he manages to subdue Alpha Primus and take a genetic sample from him. After Cawl finally manages to catch up to them, Bile drops his cocky arrogance and says something that I never in a million years thought I would hear from the chief apothecary of the 3rd Legion. He said he was impressed. He tells him that Primus is a masterpiece and that he would burn dozens of worlds before harming such a magnificent creation. And if you don't know much about Bile, the one thing that's really relevant here is that this is an individual that for thousands of years was obsessed with recreating the Primarchs. After many failed attempts and a whole lot of grotesque abominations, he would eventually succeed. Now over time, he would manage to clone every single one of them hundreds of times over, even getting to the point where they were indistinguishable copies of the original, perfect in every way. The great irony being that they were so perfect that they were ultimately deeply and irreparably flawed. For the longest time, Bile thought that he had made some kind of mistake, that he simply had way more to learn before he could match the Emperor's abilities. However, at one point, he came to a sudden and terrible realization that he wasn't lacking in ability, it's that the Primarchs were a failed experiment. There was no way to make something so broken and flawed truly perfect. This led him to become completely disillusioned with the Primarchs, and further led him to begin his new men project instead. So when he's looking at Alpha Primus here, whose origin is intrinsically linked to those Primarchs that he wrote off, and he says that he's impressed, it's kind of a big deal. He goes on to question Cawl if he's revealed to Guilliman what Primus really is, whether he had told Primus himself what he really was. He reasons in this moment that he probably hadn't, as if Primus had known what he was capable of and unleashed his full power, there was no universe where Bile would have been walking out of here alive. It's an absolutely awesome scene, and if you haven't read that book, I highly recommend it. It's definitely better if you've read Bile's trilogy and the great work beforehand, but it's not necessary. You can just jump right in as long as you know a little bit about both of these characters. As of the time of this recording, this was the last time that we saw Alpha Primus in the lore, and it's one hell of a cliffhanger for whatever Guy Haley is planning to do next with him. Primus has always been presented to us as this cryptic and mysterious character, but Bile is basically telling us that we have no idea. There is so much more to him than we've been led to believe. So, in that sense, what are some of the prevailing theories within the 40k community concerning his true nature? Well, as you can probably guess, a lot of them involve the Primarchs. Some believe that he's a perfect blending of all 20 that simply hasn't come online yet. Others think he's a brand new Primarch, a Primaris version of a Primarch, if you will. There are even claims that he doesn't contain the genetic material of any of the known Primarchs, that this is simply a red herring. Instead, he is a combination of the two lost ones. Some theories point to his enormous stature and suggest that it doesn't come from the Primarchs at all, but instead from the Thunder Warriors, that Cawl managed to find a way to perfect and stabilize them. Now others argue that Alpha Primus might be a perfected Primarch, one without the tragic flaws that plagued his predecessors. And don't get me wrong, I find all of those theories fascinating, but to me, the most interesting theories are the ones that don't tie him to the Primarchs at all, but instead to the Emperor himself. Think about it, and I know this is aggressively oversimplifying it, but if we consider each Primarch represents 1/20th of the Emperor's power and personality, what would happen if you brought all of them together in a single being? Fair enough, it would almost certainly be unstable and likely wouldn't survive for very long. But what if somebody had all of the tools necessary to make it work? A towering intellect, a loose definition of ethics, and thousands of years to plan. Many fans within the 40k community believe that Alpha Primus is actually a successor to the Emperor, perhaps even a clone, or, in the most outlandish version of the theory, a vessel, something designed to facilitate the Emperor's rebirth, the only being in the galaxy capable of containing the godlike soul of the master of mankind. This theory is supported by a scene in the beginning of Genefather, where an Alpha Primus is astral projecting, and an entity appears to him in the form of a giant golden two-headed eagle and makes psychic contact. Now, it's not explicitly spelled out for us that this definitely is the Emperor, it's just something that's heavily implied, as is often the case whenever the Emperor makes contact with anyone in this franchise. But considering that it is him, there's a lot of weight in their interaction. The way the Emperor's voice is described here is super interesting. It was broken, cracked, a used-up voice long past the peak of its powers, fragmentary, almost a chorus of itself, so broken into pieces it was. Primus. Cawl. Primus felt a regard with that voice. There was a concern in it, verging on disgust. And something else. Curiosity, hope, those two emotions certainly. Others too, he thought. Primus, a rival to your maker. The conversation goes on a bit more here, but it's not particularly relevant to what we're talking about. The Emperor is mostly appearing to him to set the novel up and warn him that Fabius Bile is coming. Considering for a moment that this actually is the Emperor here, his reaction is fascinating, that he views Primus, a perfected version of his own creations, with a mixture of curiosity, hope, and disgust. Anyways, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself with this theory, as a lot of things would need to be explained in order for it to actually make sense, but I do like the concept. Now, these are all just fan theories, and for any of them to be proven or disproven, Alpha Primus would need to become a much larger figure within the 40k mythos. Right now, he's still fairly an obscure character. He's never been given his own dedicated novel. He doesn't have a model in the tabletop game, he hasn't appeared in any media outside of 3 books and 1 short story, and he's always been presented as a side character. The major thing that makes me just a little bit nervous for his future is that all of the source material involving him has been written by a single author, Guy Haley. If you primarily engage with 40k through the codexes, tabletop game, video games, or anything else other than the Black Library novels, you may not be aware of its many different sub-universes. And these aren't alternate realities like you'll find in Marvel or DC. It's more like every major 40k author tends to create their own personal sandbox. They invent new characters, locations, and plot lines that they continue to revisit in later books. And most of the time, these stories stay contained within that author's body of work and don't really branch out into the wider franchise. Now, that's not always the case. There's definitely some characters and factions that have broken this mold, famously the Blood Ravens from the Dawn of War video games, or Ephriel Stern from the Demonifuge comic book line, but there is a precedent for it. Fantastic characters, ones with the potential to take the franchise in bold, exciting new directions, sadly often end up withering away, forgotten by the larger canon. Now, I'm pretty confident in saying that we certainly have not seen the last of Primus. He's almost certainly going to show up in more novels, and I do think we will eventually get some answers about what he really is. But it's just as likely that those answers won't fundamentally change anything about the setting. It could be something like this. We learn that yes, he was meant to be the Emperor's vessel, but then he heroically sacrifices himself before that destiny could be fulfilled. Or in true Warhammer fashion, everyone's favorite kleptomaniac robot, Trozen the Infinite, shows up out of nowhere, slaps him in a Tesseract vault, and whisks him away to his magical retcon museum. But what do you think of all this? Do you think Alpha Primus is set to be a major player in the 40k storyline going forward? What do you think he actually is? Do you believe any of the fan theories I mentioned before, or do you have a different one you subscribe to? What direction do you think Games Workshop is going to go with him? What do you think of him as a character? Do you love him or do you hate him? Let me know all of your thoughts, comments, questions, concerns, and ideas for future videos down in the comment section below. Big thanks to everyone who supports all the work that I do, and I will catch you all in the next one.